Welcome everyone to this year's convening, Truth and Transformation 2020, Beyond Diversity and Inclusion, Examining the Limits of the Business Model. We have over 1,000 people registered with 3 keynotes, 3 panels, and 2 live performances lined up. And we're very excited you can be with us today. We're using a new platform. So first I will ask for your patience as we deal with any technical glitches. If you need any technical help, please direct message Shorenstein Center. Put your comments and questions in the chat box to the right, and we'll be reading those throughout the day. Please tweet and post to social media, hashtag Truth and Transformation at IARA_HKS. You can direct message any participants to the right-hand panel. All keynotes and panels will be recorded, closed captioned, and sent to registrants at a later date. Performances will not be recorded, and we ask that you do not record them. Over lunch, we will have Jason Eskridge performing live, and we'll also have an opportunity for you to use the networking option on Hopin. If you want to learn more about today's presenters, please visit our website. The link will be pinned in the chat. Please note today's convening was free and open to the public, and we hope to keep it that way. If you would like to donate to the IARA project, you can do so by following the Donate Now button, also pinned in the chat. Finally, in the next few weeks, the IARA project will be launching a new website to democratize data around anti-racism research. We will follow up with everyone who is registered for the convening today when our website, the Race, Research, and Policy Portal, or RAP, goes live. We are honored today to open the convening with Elizabeth Solomon, an enrolled member and officer of the Massachusetts tribe at Ponkapog. She is currently the Director of Administration in the Department of Social and Behavioral Sciences at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health, and will give our land acknowledgement. Elizabeth, I pass it over to you.
I'm speaking to you from native space. I'm speaking to you from native space and the traditional lands of the Massachusetts tribe, where Harvard is located. If you live or visit our lands, I ask that you treat them as something precious, because they are. When Indigenous communities in the United States gather together, they traditionally acknowledge and honor the ancestral holders of the land that they are meeting on. Many non-Native communities have begun to incorporate this practice in public events, both to honor the Native peoples who belong to the land and to recognize that the use of the lands by others has come as a result of the displacement of its original holders. 10,000 years ago, Boston Harbor was dry land, and we were here. 1,000 years ago, much as what is now known as the city of Boston was underwater, and we were here. 400 years ago, English colonists came to occupy our land, and we were here. Today, most of Greater Boston is a major urban area occupied by others, and still, we are here. Here is where we laughed, cried, loved, made music, practiced our beliefs, shared both food and knowledge, and made both useful and sacred things. Here is where we raised our children and buried and honored our dead. Here's where English colonists began their conquest of the continent. Here is where our relationships with the colonists were built, destroyed, and built again. Some of these relationships were friendly and beneficial. Others were fraught with conflict, sadness, and loss. Here is where those who came to live among us saw land, resources, and sometimes people as commodities to be bought and sold. Here is where we maintained, sometimes in secret, our commitment to our own values and beliefs about the nature of the world, the land, resources, and people. Here is where we made alliances, intermarried, and made ongoing communities with people from other Native groups and with those from other cultures. Here is where we continue to live, holding the land and the traditions of our ancestors, and here is where our children's children will continue after us. Here is where we laugh, cry, love, make music, practice our beliefs, share both food and knowledge, and make both useful and sacred things. Here is where we raise our children and bury and honor our dead. Most of us are familiar with the colonization that affected this entire continent and much of the world. The effects of this colonization remain with us and are particularly relevant to the topics we will discuss today. But do not imagine that the colonization of this place was something that happened and was completed centuries ago, or that it is currently limited to certain peoples, places, or practices. The systems that resulted in the colonization of this land and its people are still in place. The colonization of this place and others continues, and we are all complicit in this continued colonization. We continue to colonize when we build so many structures that we cannot see or touch the actual earth, that other living things are permanently displaced, and that rainwater must be diverted far away from where it lands. We continue to colonize when we gentrify neighborhoods, not to improve the lives of those who already live there, but rather to displace their homes, their way of life, and their institution so that we may be more comfortable. We continue to colonize when we ignore or discount the unique knowledge, beliefs, and perspectives of those who do not have the background, education, vocabulary, or resources that we enjoy. We continue to colonize when we work and study and shop in small protected enclaves that separate us from the communities around us. We continue to colonize when we use a community's resources but fail to contribute to its well-being. We continue to colonize anytime we hoard resources for the benefit of the few. These acts of continued colonization are not limited to us with power, those of us with power, influence, or riches. This continued colonization is part of a bigger system in which we all participate. Colonization is not a concept. It is a way of being in the world that is dependent upon individual and collective acts of colonization. And each and every one of us, in small ways and in large ones, is a colonist. I mentioned earlier the protocol of acknowledging native lands and people, but I challenge non-native peoples and institutions to go beyond verbal land acknowledgements and to consider what it might really mean to honor native space. Honoring the land means honoring the entire space that we are a part of. It acknowledges our inseparable connectedness with everything else in the world. Honoring native space means understanding that everything we do, even the breaths that we take, has an effect well beyond our individual lives. So I honor the directions, I honor the land, I honor the water, I honor the sky, I honor the sun and the moon and the stars. I honor the other living things that share this space with us. I honor the ancestors who came before me and those who will come after me. I honor everything that lives with respect within this space. The honoring of native land and peoples may be new to you, and it's only a small part of this event. But I ask you to remember that wherever you are in the Americas and in much of the larger world, you are in native space and that there are indigenous people that belong to that place. Be mindful of how you interact with that space and with its people. May all that we do in native spaces both honor the land and prepare the way for all of those to come. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth. My name is Erica Licht. I'm a senior fellow with the Institutional Anti-Racism and Accountability Project. And again, we're so happy to be with you all this morning. I have the pleasure of handing off to Seti Warren, the Executive Director of the Shorenstein Center on Media, Politics, and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. Amongst many roles, Seti previously served as mayor of Newton, Massachusetts from 2010 to 2018. And Seti will be joining us through a very savvy tech means via video here.
Thank you so much, Erica, for that introduction. On behalf of the Shorenstein Center and our Center Director, Nancy Gibbs, I want to welcome everyone to the Harvard Kennedy School for this incredibly important discussion we're going to have this afternoon and this morning. Before I offer some thoughts and introduce Dr. Muhammad, I want to thank Miriam Ashkenazi for her tireless effort as the project director for IARA over the years, not just for putting together this important event, but also getting this project off the ground. So thank you so much, Miriam, for your efforts. The Shorenstein Center's driving mission is to ensure that we have a healthy ecosystem of information. Our democracy depends on it. We do this by highlighting bad information that's in that ecosystem, disinformation and misinformation, so that people in the fields of media and public policy and organizations can make sound judgments. We also do this by highlighting good information and research so that organizations can make good, sound decisions for the people they represent. That's what IARA seeks to do. Highlight good information in regard to anti-racism work so that organizations can make progress, and highlight information and policy decisions that are not effective so that organizations can shift course and make change. That's why I'm so proud of the efforts by the IARA project and team, the progress they've made over the past years, and what they're going to do in the future. Now it's my honor and a real privilege and joy to introduce my friend, Dr. Muhammad. Dr. Muhammad brings a vast intellect to the Kennedy School, as well as this project in the Shorenstein Center. He brings remarkable teaching skills for all of us, including our students at the school. And he brings a vast, deep knowledge of institutional racism in the United States. But what's most important and unique is his leadership. He does this and he provides leadership by not being afraid to ask all of us to look ourselves in the mirror and ask the question, are we doing enough in regard to anti-racism in our own organizations? Are we actually embracing the right policies and procedures to make a difference in regard to anti-racism in our own organizations? And he brings together the leading minds in the field all around the world in our country to ensure that organizations can indeed make a difference in regard to anti-racism. So it's my pleasure and privilege to introduce our leader in this field and my friend, Dr. Khalil Muhammad.
Dear Seti, it is so great to have that incredible introduction from you, and I am deeply honored that you were able to join us today. Since your time at the Shorenstein Center, I've seen tremendous growth in what the center does, the kind of incredible research and knowledge that is put out in the world, the work of our colleague Joan Donovan in shielding our democracy against the disinformation that exists right now. And so I want to thank you, Seti, for your leadership, Nancy for hers, and for all the folks who work behind the scenes to make sure that the IARA project itself is able to do its best work. I am also extremely honored today to welcome you to the second annual Truth and Transformation Conference of the IARA project. We are very pleased to have all of you join us today. Over 900 people, up to over 1,000 at this point, a number far larger than we hosted last year, have registered for this conference. You've heard a little bit about who I am, but I want to tell you a little bit more about the project itself. I am joined in this work by a fabulous team. Our project director, Miriam Ashkenazi, who Seti just mentioned, is the backbone of the work that we do. She holds it all together and like a composer is able to direct many moving parts. And so I am grateful for her tireless commitment to this work. She's a former emergency room physician and an international humanitarian. And so she's seen some really tough stuff. And I'm grateful that she's willing to face the work that we do squarely in the face. I also want to thank Senior Fellow Erica Licht, who you will see later today. She is an established anti-racist trainer in her own right and brings a wealth of practice and experience to our work. I'm grateful that she's leading our project with the Kellogg Foundation on looking at racial healing practices globally so that we might here begin to do some of the truth and reconciliation work that the United States needs. Also, our postdoctoral fellow, Suraj Yindi, is an amazing scholar of caste. He's one of the world's most celebrated and controversial, for good reason, Dalit scholars. He's been with us now for more than 2 years at the Shorenstein Center and supporting the IARA project more generally. So I'm grateful for Suraj's contributions. We have an advisory member, Carrie Ratcliffe, who provides hours and hours of volunteer work to support us, and we're grateful for Carrie and all that she brings. Ali Hinsky of the Shorenstein Center continues to be an amazing staff person to support us. We also have several current Kennedy School students and members of the HKS, or the Harvard Kennedy School Equity Coalition. They are Ratna Gill, Ariel Exner, who will both be live tweeting, along with Benjamin Aptan, who's a current course assistant of mine. So that's who we are, that's the team, and you're going to see from today's conference over the next several hours how important this work is to all of us. So Seti mentioned briefly a little bit about the IARA project. I want to say a few things more. We are a one-year-old research initiative whose goal is to collect evidence of what's working and not working, largely in the private and nonprofit sectors, where claims of diversity and inclusion, or equity and belonging, seem to consistently fall short of changing the norms and practices of organizations. The project's first phase is to examine published research, both by academics and practitioners, to produce what we call a meta-analysis, a big picture of what's the best out there that we know when it comes to racial equity and organizational behavioral change. In many ways, we are contributing to the body of work of our own colleagues, Frank Dobbins in sociology and Robert Livingston here at the Harvard Kennedy School. Recently, I was asked by the Harvard Gazette, what are the primary obstacles to racial equity in workplaces? Is it sins of commission or sins of omission, or both? Well, here's what I said. I said all of the above. Some of the research suggests that companies have no intention of doing anything more than passing a symbolic litmus test. That is, how do we look? Do we have enough representation to satisfy customer expectations? Do we have the appropriate systems in place so that our own employees can feel included in affinity groups or in employee resource groups? A lot of companies are still hiring diversity officers for the first time, which is already known to be a fairly weak adaptation when it comes to failing to achieve a company's own diversity goals. We have good evidence that diversity officers are not very effective, especially when firms don't expect to change the way they do business or the way that HR policies are established. One of the things that we're noticing is that companies that are more honest about their past, whether it is a 200-year-old company or a 20-year-old one or a tech startup, there's a good chance that given the existing racialized and gendered power dynamics that exist in the United States, that unless you were intentional, you are not going to be a very diverse place. The second question becomes, what are the blind spots of the leadership that prevented it from seeing areas of the company's business model that might either be doing harm or be neglecting parts of the community it claims to serve? Those two things, what we call a historical reckoning, that's the truth part, taking stock of how your organization came to be and then acting intentionally to redress that path, would then lead a company to take affirmative intentional efforts. That's the transformation part. That is to, number one, diversify its personnel, and number two, consider how the business model itself might be perpetuating racial inequality or institutional racism. In addition to truth and transformation, the recurring theme of our annual conference, this is our second one, we are also interested in accountability. How do organizations hold themselves accountable for their stated goals? How do stakeholders in companies, in the company and outside of it, hold them accountable to their own goals? Surprisingly, we're still in an era when companies don't self-report very much data about their own stated diversity claims. They're not required to. So that's one area of accountability. If a company is serious, then it should have a robust set of metrics for measuring what it considers racial equity as it does any other core operation. The bigger question, though, is how do you achieve accountability sector by sector? That is one of the questions that IARA hopes to answer. We're using the example of environmental building codes that promote sustainable change, such as LEED standards, for example. If the IARA project can establish an accreditation process whereby companies that claim to be on a spectrum of diversity, racial equity, and anti-racism, where diversity goals are limited to, say, personnel representation, then perhaps you've just achieved a bronze certification. Racial equity would include something more robust in terms of your HR policies, that is, having a clear system of how to report micro and macroaggressions, something that often is not very clear in the workplace today. That might get you a silver certification. And then anti-racism would be the platinum standard. That would be a way of also reflecting the way we do business in the world matches our stated values about the kind of nation we want to be part of. Establishing clear, transparent, and verifiable standards will benefit the private and nonprofit sectors, as well as civil society in general. Millions of people lose when companies and organizations don't practice what they preach, which is why we have accounting rules and reporting requirements for organizations such as FASB and GAAP rules. I'll admit, that's a little inside baseball, having started my career as a public accountant at Deloitte, informs how I personally think about accountability. As far as accountability standards, we know corruption and environmental degradation, like the kind that Elizabeth Solomon opened this morning up in talking about the history of colonization, are only the most obvious consequences when bad actors operate in the private sector with impunity. But there are many more deeply entrenched and more less obvious ways that organizations profit from enduring patterns and practices of racial and gendered exclusion, where black and brown women's bodies, brains, and assets, along with their partners and their children, are priced lower in the marketplace than their white, female, and male counterparts. Not only are they considered riskier employees to hire, riskier borrowers to lend money, riskier neighbors to live next door to, riskier students to share classmates with. Risk is a pricing tool, an efficiency measure in the marketplace that assigns value. No one has to act consciously to game this system of profiting from discrimination, though of course some do. They just have to follow the market indicators and, of course, new algorithms of where people live, their credit scores, and their net worth in order to make money. Adding more black and brown people to your staff won't solve these problems, which is why we are here today to think through what are the limits of the current business model of diversity and inclusion. In this moment, it seems to us that the pressing question of how to move diversity and inclusion beyond where it's been in the private sector, as well as in other organizations, is more important than ever. Following a summer where millions took to the streets demanding an end to systemic racism in the United States, hundreds of organizations, if not thousands, issued Black Lives Matter and racial justice solidarity statements. My colleague, Erica Licht, our senior research fellow, and I published an op-ed, Why Words Aren't Enough for Companies Claiming to Support Black Lives Matter, in the Boston Globe, July 7th edition. We wrote, solidarity statements allow companies to invest in goodwill without investing in substantive change, a practice also known as diversity washing or reputational laundering. What organization wants to be accused of being pro-racist or complacently silent? The bar for public reckoning has been set low in the United States. Public efforts at recognizing and committing to dismantling systems of oppression and institutional racism remain often trivial at best. In many corporate statements, familiar themes have emerged, calling out racism, standing with the black community, and speaking up as allies. But these words are not enough. If history is any guide, without a roadmap, organizations will fail to act in meaningful and sustainable ways. And yet, based on our research so far, we remain cautiously optimistic that real change is possible. Here's what we hope for. Companies must first be honest in their solidarity statements about their own past failures. This isn't just about what happens beyond the company's walls, but in fact also what happens inside that moves outside. And the perpetual goal of achieving diversity cannot be a substitute for redistributing organizational power and pursuing racial justice in society. every company should track its overall percentage of black employees or brown employees or historically marginalized employees, including those in senior leadership and on boards, as well as the actual expenses funneled toward ending systemic racism. That's right. How does a company itself lean into the kind of society it wants to be part of? Leaders must reckon with, for instance, why their company may overcharge black customers for goods, services, and access to credit, or why their enhanced security surveillance of black shoppers is not much different than racial profiling by the police. They must also recognize that all of us, individuals and organizations alike, are interdependent. The racial oppression in society mirrors and catalyzes racial oppression in the workplace. What's painfully clear about diversity and solidarity statements is they are a lot easier to write than to follow. After all, most everyone has both. So pursuing anti-racist change isn't easy or comfortable. Organizations must account for their own exclusionary histories and their ongoing policies and practices of systemic racism where they find them. They must be held accountable. In the current issue of the Scientific American, the journalist Abigail Libbers writes on how, quote, implicit bias training isn't enough, what actually works. She cites a recent analysis of 492 studies, including 87,000 participants, on the effectiveness of implicit bias training and found weak effects on unconscious bias. The authors wrote, quote, most studies focused on producing short-term changes with brief single-session manipulations, and that most trainings produce trivial changes in behavior. The authors conclude that the changes in implicit bias are possible, but they do not necessarily translate into changes in explicit bias or behavior, and there is a significant lack of research on these long-term effects. Indeed, one of those researchers, my colleague Frank Dobbin, notes that going all the way back to the 1930s, such implicit bias efforts have failed time and time again. I'll even add, as someone who studies criminal justice practices, I can tell you going back to 1922 in the midst of a massive anti-black riot in Chicago, one of the conclusions at the time amongst those who studied it, the officials who looked closely into it, including the governor of Illinois, was that unconscious bias was a problem and they were going to do something about it. So I think we have pretty good evidence that we've got to do a lot more than that. And so we realize in the grand scheme of things that this is very dispiriting. Our goal, though, is not to despair, but to be honest, to be truthful, to rise to the challenge, to keep our head out of the sand, but clearly focused on the horizon, and to promote the solutions that may require truly transformative work, one organization and one institution at a time. We will either wake up or keep hitting the snooze button. That's the choice we make. But I can speak for all of us here at the IARA Project. We're glad you woke up this morning to join us. What are we trying to accomplish today? We've assembled an amazing group of people who have been doing this work, and we want to have these insiders speak to us based on what they've learned. We don't want to know the obvious. We want to know what we don't know. This gives us a chance at IARA to test our own assumptions and to learn from others. We hope the 1,000 of you watching will benefit as well. And that gives me the great moment here to introduce our first keynote speaker. She is the award-winning journalist and professor of journalism at New York University and a very dear friend of mine, Pamela Newkirk. Prior to New York University, she was a daily reporter at 4 news organizations, including New York Newsday, where she was part of a Pulitzer Prize-winning reporting team. Professor Newkirk is also the author of Spectacle, The Astonishing Life of Ota Benga, which won the NAACP Image Award, as well as the book Within the Veil, Black Journalism, White Media, which won the National Press Club Award for Media Criticism. Among the best and sharpest observers of America's racial landscape, her latest book, Diversity Incorporated, The Failed Promise of a Billion-Dollar Business, exposes the decades-old practices and attitudes that have made diversity a lucrative business while they fail to realize diversity. The book was included on Time Magazine's must-read books of 2019 and featured in numerous publications, including Time, Forbes, and Fortune magazines. Please join me in a very warm virtual welcome to Pamela Newkirk. Thank you so much for being with us this morning.
Oh, thank you, Khalil. I'm so delighted to join you today for this most timely conference, and I'm honored to be among such illustrious speakers, including yourself. So you've asked me to discuss the research that culminated in my latest book, Diversity, Inc., The Failed Promise of a $1 billion Business. And when it was first published a year ago, I had the privilege of sitting down with you, Khalil, for a conversation at MIT Sloan School of Management. And of course, since that time, particularly since the tragic killing of George Floyd and the frontal assault on diversity from the White House, there's no longer a need to convince anyone of the urgency of this issue or of how little progress has been made. With Fortune 500 CEOs declaring that Black Lives Matter, there are few who still maintain, as many long had, that our nation is post-race. But the question remains, why, despite the billions of dollars devoted to diversity initiatives each year, is 40% of the nation's population still completely underrepresented in every influential field? And why is the business of diversity flourishing while racial diversity is not? It's impossible to understand this issue of diversity without exploring the big business of it, the tension between the rhetoric and the expenditures, and the chronically dismal results. So my book examines the 5 decades long effort to diversify the American workplace and why progress has stalled and in some cases is in retreat. The numbers are telling. Between 2009 and 2018, the percentage of Black law partners has barely inched up from 1.7 to 1.8%. People of color comprise just 8% of law firm partners. Between 1985 and 2016, the proportion of Black men in management at companies with 100 or more employees increased from 3% to 3.2%. Blacks and Hispanics are roughly 31% of the population, but hold just 4% and 3% respectively of full-time professorships, numbers that have barely budged in decades. Between 2004 and 2016, the white composition of corporate board seats has changed little, decreasing from 85.1% to 82.5%, with people of color holding about 17% of Fortune 500 board seats. And of course, with the retirement 2 years ago of Ken Chenault as CEO of American Express, the number of Black Fortune 500 CEOs is down to 3. So this acute underrepresentation defies the quickening pace of change in the nation's racial demographics. In 2011, for the first time in American history, more babies of color were born than non-Hispanic whites. And since 2010, non-Hispanic whites have been the minority in 22 of the nation's 100 largest metropolitan areas. And of course, they're projected by 2045 to no longer constitute a national majority. But while diversity has become one of the buzzwords of our time, part of the problem is the term itself. Diversity has come to encompass racial and ethnic minorities, along with women, physical and mental capacity, gender, sexual orientation, and other marginalized populations. Indeed, there's little agreement on what diversity even means. A survey of 771 college and university chief diversity officers found that 63% had difficulty even arriving at a common definition, with ideas ranging from simply valuing difference to social justice for those who have been historically disadvantaged. And then in 2018, Apple's first ever vice president of inclusion and diversity took the ever-evolving term to its seemingly logical conclusion when she suggested that 12 blue-eyed, blonde, white men could illustrate diversity due to their different backgrounds. And when asked whether she would focus on underrepresented minorities, Denise Young Smith, who is Black and a woman, responded, quote, "I focus on everyone. Diversity is the human experience. I get a little frustrated when diversity is tagged to people of color or the women or the LGBT," close quote. So as diversity has become untethered from the history and legacy of racial injustice, the plight of racial minorities in general and African Americans in particular have been eclipsed. Overlooked too are the ways in which racial minorities are doubly and triply burdened by interlocking systems of discrimination related to physical and cognitive ability, gender, sexual orientation, and the like. So in Diversity, Inc., I specifically explore the issue of racial diversity and focus on the three largest racial and ethnic minority groups, even as the stark disparities between Blacks and whites remains the most illuminating indicator of America's racial breach. In examining the data and conversing with scores of people on the front line of the movement for change, I discovered some of the reasons why many are still pondering and gesturing rather than meaningfully increasing racial diversity. And I'll highlight 5 of the biggest impediments. One, first and foremost, is racial custom, the legacy of racial hierarchies stamped into the American DNA, an enduring ideology that permeates mass media, public iconography, so-called high art, the Western literary canon, and education curricula from grade school through higher education. The dismal numbers reported year after year are a predictable outcome of embedded racial attitudes and dominant narratives that define our culture. Much of the unrest we've seen in recent weeks and months is a reaction to the ways in which this ethos is expressed in policing, but also in public iconography and the disparities in the COVID epidemic, employment, and every other social indicator. Along with these disparities is a racial illiteracy and a historical amnesia that undermines a true understanding of the underlying causes of systemic inequality. And number 2 is just social networks. We live in a rigorously segregated society. People in the academy, Hollywood, and corporate America, like those in every other influential field, often hire people from their small social and professional networks. These networks often exclude people of color. For example, as at colleges and universities, faculty search committees generally have wide latitude to reach out to anyone they deem suitable or desirable to join the faculty. Hiring, then, is a subjective process, and candidate finalists typically mirror the networks of those leading the search. Searches often result in the hiring of friends and former colleagues or people whose backgrounds, scholarly interests, and sensibilities mirror those of the committee members. The candidates then tend to reflect the overwhelmingly white composition of the faculty. And when you add to this process of self-referential decision-making, the network of influential people who are asked to write letters of recommendation, and all but a small number of racial minorities are left out of the loop. For junior-level prospective candidates whose scholarship challenge white norms and views embedded in Eurocentric canons, the odds are especially long. Moreover, once institutions do prioritize diversity, many attempt to recruit the same small cadre of proven stars in their fields while overlooking emerging people of color in the pipeline. So as a result, the same superstars of color are recycled and they move between institutions while the overall number of people of color remains unchanged. Number 3, failed diversity practices. As you noted, Khalil, in your opening remarks, While many institutions have in recent years hired chief diversity officers and instituted diversity programs, there's a growing body of scholarship that suggests that much of the training mandated by thousands of institutions doesn't work, and in some instances make matters worse. Quote, strategies for controlling bias, which drive most diversity efforts, have failed spectacularly, Harvard professor Frank Dobbin and Tel Aviv professor Alev Alexandra concluded in their study Why Diversity Programs Fail. Noting the lack of progress in management of Black men since 1985 and white women since 2000, they wrote, quote, it isn't that there aren't enough educated women and minorities out there. Both groups have made huge educational gains over the past 2 generations. The problem is that we can't motivate people by forcing them to get with the program and punishing them if they don't, close quote. Dobbin and Alexandra examined 3 decades of data from 800 U.S. firms and interviewed hundreds of managers and executives and found that mandatory training often triggers a backlash, particularly among white men. A recent case in point is the executive order by the president, which has banned diversity training, which he calls racist. So rather than being converted, white men often react with anger and resistance. Even more troubling is the adverse impact mandatory training appears to have on those it's intended to help. 5 years after instituting mandatory training, they found that on average, the number of Black women in management dropped 9.2%, and the number of Asian women and men decreased between 4.3 and 5.4%. Another influential study, Prejudice Reduction, What Works, a review and assessment of research, is one of the most comprehensive studies on the efficacy of diversity programs, and it concluded, quote, we currently do not know whether a wide range of programs and policies intended to work on average, and we are quite far from having an empirically grounded understanding of the conditions under which these programs work best. Moreover, the authors Elizabeth Patlock and Donald Green found that the positive effects of diversity training at best last a day or two, and even then can trigger backlash. So there's little evidence that the initiatives most commonly employed by most institutions work, yet they continue to spend billions each year with little to show for it, which begs the question, why are institutions doing the same thing year after year and expecting different results? Number 4, the diversity backlash. Following the civil rights movement, America had begun to make tremendous progress towards closing the racial gap in education and income. However, by the end of the 1970s, affirmative action gave way to the still resounding cries of reverse discrimination. In 1978, in Bakke versus the University of California, the U.S. Supreme Court narrowly ruled in favor of Alan Bakke, the white student who sued the University of California Medical School for reserving 16 out of 100 seats for racial minorities. In a 5-4 decision, the U.S. Supreme Court struck down the use of racial quotas in college admissions, saying they violated the 14th Amendment's Equal Protection Clause. Writing for the majority, Supreme Court Justice Lewis Powell explained, quote, there is a measure of inequity in forcing innocent persons in Bakke's position to bear the burden of redressing grievances not of their making, close quote. The ruling meant that past discrimination of disadvantaged groups could no longer be considered a factor in admission decisions. The Bakke decision, of course, was followed in 1981 with the dismantlement of federal anti-discrimination programs under the Reagan administration, and by the 1980s, many of the gains made during the 1960s, including school integration, were erased along with federal policies that had begun to effectively close the education and poverty gap without whites losing ground. As historian Carol Anderson recounts in White Rage, cuts in federal job and education programs that had aided the progress caused black unemployment to skyrocket to 15.5%, the highest it had been since the Great Depression, and black youth unemployment rose to 45.7%. College enrollment among African Americans tumbled from 34 to 26%. Thus, Anderson wrote, just at the moment when the post-industrial economy made an undergraduate degree more important than ever, 15,000 fewer African Americans were in college during the early 1980s than had been the case in the mid-1970s. So these attacks had an immediate effect on the diversity of college student bodies. For example, after California's passage in 1996 of Proposition 209, which abolished affirmative action programs in state hiring, contracting, and college admissions, minority admissions plummeted 61% at UC Berkeley and 36% at UCLA. Similarly, the percentage of Rice University's freshman class dropped 36% after Texas eliminated affirmative action programs. I spoke to Columbia University President Lee Bollinger, who pointed out that diversity has become an abstract concept due to the Bakke decision. He said, quote, "We're deprived of the context that gave it a sense of mission. Every college leader is told do not refer to history. I think we have a meaningless, abstract conversation about diversity without a rationale," close quote. And of course, the backlash to diversity continues. Just last week, the President of the United States signed the executive order on combating race and sex stereotyping, which forbids federal agencies and contractors from offering diversity training. Number 5 is leadership. Diversity, or the lack thereof, is a leadership issue. While the diversity apparatus, the task forces, climate surveys, diversity czars, and consultants suggests that achieving diversity is rocket science, my research shows that achieving it primarily requires committed leadership and intention. Instead, many institutional leaders have farmed the problem out to consultants or chief diversity officers who are often marginalized in the workplace. Said Bollinger, you have to believe in a principle of justice. You have to make it front and center. I think it's a matter of intention. If it's a pipeline issue, you have to work on the pipeline. The entire institution has to be behind it. Leadership. So I've spent most of the time explaining why we don't have racial diversity, but the good news is that there are successful models that can be replicated. We have never been short on solutions, only will. In Diversity, Inc., I devote a chapter to outlining how the Coca-Cola Company diversified its workforce following a landmark discrimination lawsuit settlement in 2000. Over the course of 5 years, and with a system of transparent metrics and accountability, it was able to detect and disrupt patterns of bias that had metastasized in hiring, promotions, salaries, performance evaluations, and bonus awards. They began with an audit of employees across race, gender, and job categories, which allowed them to see where people were clustered or underrepresented along race and gender lines. The company then required managers to account for decisions before they were finalized. So before a hiring decision was made, they'd look at the candidate pool and the outreach that was done. Before salaries were finalized, they'd look at the patterns of bias along racial and gender lines. With vigilance and accountability, Coca-Cola was able to avert instances of bias in real time. And by the end of 5 years, the company had managed to hire and promote a far greater number of African Americans and women, while ensuring greater equity. But tellingly, a recent Russell Reynolds survey of Fortune 500 diversity professionals found that only 35% even had access to their company metrics, and most said they lacked the support and resources to effectively do their jobs. I can outline other successful strategies like mentoring and outreach to overlooked professional networks of color, and of course incentivizing diversity the same way companies incentivize profits and innovation. But none of these strategies are likely to bear fruit without committed leadership and intention. In recent weeks, we've seen the speed with which entrenched practices and policies can change. All around, Confederate monuments are falling while companies are belatedly retiring iconic images that romanticize Black servitude. We've seen a major sports team and a prestigious college finally concede that names matter, while cities and states are implementing police reforms that they have long resisted. So we know that change is less a matter of time and tactics than will. As Bollinger said, quote, "Left to its own devices, it won't happen." I thank you for your time and look forward to engaging your questions.
Hi, Pam. That was really remarkable. And as you informed others, we've done this before. And I won't call it growth. I will just call it precision. And I think that of those watching who are hearing you for the first time, you provided a template really for understanding both the problems in a clear, precise way as well as the solutions. I just want to summarize them again because I think it's important. You described racial customs and an enduring ideology of exclusion and embedded narratives as a problem. You talked about segregated networks where essentially people who already have these jobs go to the communities that they already are a part of to recruit newcomers to those communities. And so it just reinforces the same networks and privilege. You talked about training doesn't work, and in fact provided more insight into what researchers have found, like Dobbin, with regard to how things look 5 years out, actually look worse than they were before the trainers came in. You talked about the civil rights backlash, which I think is just really incredible to remind people, because the private sector in particular, and most certainly the nonprofit sector, are not innocent in public policy. And in fact, a lot of the energy that comes in our political sphere is dominated by private sector actors. I mean, it would only take a simple look at any presidential administration to understand that the relationship between the private sector and policy, whether it's in the State House or in the White House, is one phone call away. So we have to be much more obvious in our focus on what has the private sector been leaning into over the past 40 or 50 years when it comes to this question of affirmative action, which was redistributive, which was reparative, which was about addressing, at that time, 350 years of racial exclusion. And then within what, as you point out in the Bakke decision, 13 years from the end of the Civil Rights or Voting Rights Act of 65, already on life support. Pretty remarkable history to remind us of. And then your last point about leadership. And I think that's the one in my journey in seeing up close and really being, I guess, chastened by, to recognize that in too many instances, leaders of civil society, whether in higher education or in the private sector, as you say, your own language, have farmed out this work. So I'm just really grateful for the fact that you were so clear in how we think about that. So we did get a few questions, and I'll come back to you with some more follow-up, but I want to get those questions in. So one question was small organizations. I don't know if you have insight into small organizations, but our political leaders are often bragging about how small businesses make up the engine of America. I think the economists will say that that may very well be true, but there's a whole lot of churn in those small businesses. But nevertheless, is there anything to be said about how small organizations, 3 to 5 people, small mom and pop places, where do they fit in this story, if at all?
I mean, unfortunately, this problem, I see it across the board, whether we're talking about the arts or whether we're talking about corporate America or whether we're talking about big or small. I think it's the behavior of people who are in these positions continue to replicate, their own professional and social networks. So I don't think it much matters whether it's small or large. I think it's just it's custom, right? And one of the things that was counterintuitive going into this research, what I did not expect to find is that the fields that we consider the most progressive, like Hollywood or fashion, are the least diverse. That corporate America, for all its faults, is the most diverse. So if we have a problem there, when we begin to look at museums and, foundations, like when we begin to look more closely at these fields which kind of promote, they say all the right things about social justice and diversity and we are the world, but when you look up close, they are the least diverse.
Yeah, that's one of the, I mean, having read your book, I think that that's one of the things that's so remarkable about it is that you do look across industries and you take as a given that maybe this is easier in parts of our civil society than it would appear, but it isn't. And of course, we know from April Reign's activism around Oscars So White that the entertainment system has come under tremendous scrutiny. And I remember Cheryl Boone Isaacs was a kind of a step in the right direction. But if I recall, you interviewed her because she's no longer the president of the Motion Picture Association. Tell our listeners what you learned from her.
Well, I actually did not. I tried to interview her, so I could only use the statements, the statements that were in the public domain. But I think she was kind of an example of how institutions deal with this issue. So they have this diversity problem, they're called out on it. So the first thing they do is they go to a person of color and they make them the face of the institution as if they can hide behind, the metrics by putting a person of color out front on it. And I think she became frustrated and she did leave that post, and I don't think she's involved with the Academy at all anymore after decades of being an active member. So I think, the problem is that so much of this has been treated as a public relations problem rather than as a social justice problem, rather than as a problem of systemic inequality, systemic injustice. I mean, we say diversity and it kind of softens what we're really talking about, right?
Yeah. Well, there's a question here about a more sort of conversation about the bias reduction or the problems of implicit bias. But I think I want to just take that question, revise it a little bit and say, make as plain as you can how people confuse implicit bias with explicit bias, because it seems to me that if I'm hearing you correctly, when you talk about the show and tell of diversity, the public relations of diversity, the symbolic appointment of Black leadership here and there of diversity, those are actually explicit intentional decisions. And so what is this line that we ought to draw or be more conscious of between kind of the excuse of implicit bias versus the intention of explicit bias?
Yeah, so that's why I wrote this book. I wanted to interrogate that tension, right, between these pronouncements and the public relations aspect of it and the lack of the thing, the lack of diversity, the lack of the practices and the policies that will actually intervene in this issue, disrupt this pattern of inequality. And so we can look at what people say, but I'm far more interested in what these institutions do. And so when you just, go behind the facade, what you see is just a real lack of attention to the policies and practices that we know could work. And they're just doing the same thing over and over, kind of knowing by now that those those practices don't work. It's if companies spent billions on anything else that was just this ineffective, I think they would change course. But on this one, they just continue to do it, and with nothing to show for it except failure, of course.
Yeah. I mean, I want to get to a couple more questions, but I keep hearing in my head that we may have an expectation of the private sector that the private sector doesn't have of itself. And I mean, one of the tensions, for example, when I hear Senator Rand Paul, who is a libertarian, and a few years ago lamented that the Civil Rights Act Public Accommodations Bill in 1964 was a mistake because a private company ought to be able to discriminate and pay a price in the marketplace for its behavior, and that the market itself would adjudicate whether or not this was a good thing or a bad thing in society. And
That's where we are. This is where we are. This used to be the things people said in private. Now,
right.
Now it's like, the outside voice, and this is what we're up against. But I still think that we're at an inflection point that that the lack of innocence, like no one can claim innocence on this issue anymore. I think it's all been just borne out, and like we don't have to waste time anymore trying to convince people that this is a problem. Now I think we all see it. So now the question is, do you want to actually do something about this, or like, do you want to just keep doing something that we've exposed as ineffective, impractical, wasteful? And now it's like the proof will be in the pudding. But I think we've at least exposed it in a way that's broken through in a way that it had not previously.
Yeah. There are a couple questions here which are things you've answered. And I'm gonna ask the two of them, and if you want to elaborate further what you've described, that's perfectly fine. So I'm going to mention these together. So one question is stated this way: similar to the upstream downstream medical model, are you finding that prevention of bias development is more effective than treatment of bias? That's one question. And then the second is, how can we effectively address such embedded issues of racial inequity when those in power to make such changes are the same individuals who benefit from the inequity?
Yeah, it's a problem. So if I understand the first question correctly, are you asking whether it's more effective to do diversity training, or if it's more effective to address it as it arises? And I would say the latter, that if you have clear policies, and we do have laws that forbid racial and gender discrimination, sexual orientation. So we already have that on the books. If that's enforced, then I think that would probably be a lot more effective than these 1 hour, 2 hour training programs that just trigger such resentment in the workplace. And I'd be even for that if there was any indication that at the end of the day it worked, but it just doesn't. I mean, we've seen year after year that it doesn't work. And the second question, Khalil.
The second question was about essentially how do you talked a lot about in the solution space about leadership, and so what happens when the leaders are really not on board?
Yeah. Well, I mean, leaders weren't on board, for emancipation. They weren't on board for the civil rights movement. They weren't on board for a lot of these issues, a lot of these matters of social justice that we had to kind of force them to pay attention to. And I don't think this is any different. I think it is an issue that has to remain on the front burner. 40% of the population cannot continually be ignored on this issue. And I do think, as I noted in recent weeks, we're seeing institutions change course on things that they were resolutely opposed to, right? So we know the difference that activism can make with millions of people, not just in this country, but around the world, leaning into this issue. They may not want to change, but I think we have already seen that, that kind of activism works, and we have to remain vigilant. Like there's no point at which we can just say it's done. I think that was the mistake that many made after the election of President Obama, as if, we've overcome, our racial issues and we're now post-race. This issue may be with us, for generations, but we have to continue to fight.
Yeah, I love this point, and I'm going to close with this and love your final reflection, because when I think about what you described in the beginning of these problems around racial customs, around public iconography, about what's in our museums and the stories we tell about Western civilization and the looted treasures of the rest of the world, and everything, school children are reinforced in this idea that, look, mommy, this came from another place, without the counter critique. Even though the critique exists, it's often kept out of those spaces, and some of that is changing right now. We're seeing some of that break down. But these school curriculums from K through 12 to college to graduate school still leave out the basic understanding of how these racial customs, as you described, work, which is to say that from my vantage point, we're actually miseducating generation after generation that America is the greatest nation on earth. If you don't like it, well, you know what you can do. Take it as it is. And that to me is the kind of downstream problem, which is to say what happens on the front end of this problem as compared to where we end up in our business schools and our law schools and the Kennedy School. Our conference last year was dedicated to the Kennedy School on truth and transformation. And I am happy to report, I wasn't going to say this now, but I think now is the most appropriate place to say that it was student activism that got my school, my employer, to for the first time require a core course on race and racism, because God forbid we train another generation of domestic policy advisors and policymakers who don't know very much about how 500 years of global racism have shaped the world that we actually live in.
Yeah, that's the racial illiteracy I speak of, and it has a real world impact on this discussion, because if you don't know this history, you just think, oh, well, these people are not trying. Like, if you don't know that there's been all this resistance to progress, over centuries, then yeah, you're going to formulate a totally different impression of what's going on.
Yeah. Well, I am so happy that you made time for us this morning. I miss seeing you in person, but this will have to substitute for now. So thank you so much. Please, everyone, join me in a virtual round of applause for Professor Pamela Newkirk, the author of Diversity, Inc. Please pick it up. It's a wonderful book and says so much more than what we were able to capture today. Thank you.
Thank you.